Good afternoon and welcome to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard Kennedy School. I'm Sushma Raman and I'm the Executive Director of the Carr Center. Welcome, whether you're joining us for the first time or you've been a long-time participant in our virtual or in-person events. It's my pleasure also on behalf of my colleague Mathias Risse to welcome our distinguished speakers and you, our audience, to today's webinar. Our conversation today is part of a series, The Fierce Urgency of Now, which addresses challenges and opportunities that connect to matters of racial and economic justice. This is a freestanding series, and we'd like to think of it as the center's flagship series for the semester. But for some of you watching it today, it's also a part of a class on economic justice that Mathias and I co-teach. One focus of both our class and this series is the intersection of economic and racial justice. And we're really honored and privileged that the entire series speakers are people of color and individuals from the global South. Today's session focuses on movement building in the US, and it follows a very lively conversation last week on global economic justice concerns with Kumi Naidoo, who's the former CEO of Amnesty and of Greenpeace, and who now runs a Pan-African social movement, as well as Cesar Rodriguez Garavito, who is the co-founder of De Justicia in Colombia, and myself. And we're going to continue this discussion this week on Thursday with Charles Mills, who's a distinguished Jamaican-born political philosopher. Today's session features two really thought-provoking and amazing thought leaders, Margaret Huang, president of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and Priscilla Ochen, professor of criminal law at Loyola Law School. I first met Margaret when she was at Amnesty as the executive director, and I met Priscilla more recently when she was a faculty member in a pioneering class I took this summer on critical race theory and intersectionality, organized by the African American Policy Forum and Columbia and UCLA law schools. I'll share a little bit about both of their work currently and then turn it over to them. In the decades since its founding, the Southern Poverty Law Center has shut down some of the nation's most violent white supremacist groups by winning, crushing multi-million-dollar jury verdicts on behalf of their victims. It has dismantled vestiges of Jim Crow, reformed juvenile justice practices, shattered barriers to equality for women, children, LGBT community, and people with disabilities, and protected low-wage immigrant workers from exploitation. In the 1980s, the SPLC began monitoring white supremacist activity amid a resurgence of the Klan, and today its intelligence project is internationally known for tracking and exposing a wide variety of hate and extremist organizations throughout the US. Margaret joined the SPLC earlier this year as the president after a long and distinguished career in human rights. Priscilla is a professor of law at Loyola Law School, where she teaches criminal law, family law, and a seminar on race, gender, and the law. Her work explores the ways in which race, gender, and class interact to render women of color vulnerable to various forms of violence and criminalization. Her work has appeared in leading academic journals as well as popular media outlets. She received the inaugural PEN America Writing for Justice Literary Fellowship and has served as a Fulbright Fellow based out of Makerere University School of Law in Kampala, where she studied the relationship between gender-based violence and women's incarceration. She's the co-author, along with Kimberly Crenshaw and Jyoti Nanda, of the influential policy report, Black Girls Matter, Pushed Out, Over-Policed, and Underprotected. I'm really delighted and honored to welcome both of them today. And I'm going to ask Margaret first and then Priscilla to share some opening remarks. And then we will open it up to questions, and we welcome questions from the audience. Please post them in the YouTube chat box, and we will be drawing on some of your questions. So over to you, Margaret.
Thank you so much, Sushma. What a great pleasure it is to be back with you all at Harvard. I've enjoyed all of my time speaking with students there, and I'm looking forward to the question and answer session of the discussion. I was really excited when Sushma invited me to join this conversation around economic justice, because it is an area where I am eager to see the Southern Poverty Law Center do even more work as we're moving forward. For us, economic justice means trying to influence the institutions that govern and manage our economy in ways that ensure equity and fairness. But in simpler terms, what it means is that we have to tackle the underlying racist structures that occur in all of our systems, in employment, in education, in housing, in access to services, including healthcare. It is because of the systemic racism that we see across all of these sectors that we end up having the problems of economic injustice in the country. And of course, many of you will be familiar with the 1619 Project and the analysis that's done there around why economic injustice continues in this country. The Southern Poverty Law Center has recently revised our vision and mission statement to be explicitly about combating racism and white supremacy, particularly in the South, but also across the country and frankly, the globe. And so for us, really tackling these racist structures is going to be critical to finding the answers for economic justice. Our work has been first and foremost in the litigation arena. We've been fighting cases on unfair fines and fees that make the court system another contributor to the poverty of the cycle of poverty. We've been fighting injustice in the spheres of Medicaid access, who has access to it, whether there are requirements such as work requirements that prevent people from being able to seek healthcare. And we've been tackling issues like the criminalization of homelessness. And in each of these, while you can see that there are systemic challenges, what undergirds all of these are the principles of racism. It is not a surprise to anyone on this call who the constituencies are we're talking about who've been denied equal access or equal opportunity. And it's clear that until we address those racist structures that we're not going to be able to find remedies to fix the individual problems. One last thing I'll note is that we've also undertaken to begin work on thinking through what could be the early steps of a different administration should one be elected in November. And one of our recommendations is that we have to have a truth and reconciliation process, one that considers what reparations might look like in this country for African Americans, for Indigenous peoples, and for other communities of color. So I'll leave it there, Sushma. Very excited about the conversation and eager to hear from Priscilla. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated your comments, Margaret, and I think our certainly will be aligned. As I said during our prep discussion, it's really an honor to be on this panel with you, given that a lot of my formative thinking about this took place in obviously undergraduate school and law school. And in law school, I was an intern at the Southern Poverty Law Center and had an opportunity to really understand the moral imperative for economic justice, particularly as it affects Black communities in the southern part of the United States, but Black communities across the country. So I'm grateful to be on the panel with you, and thank you so much, Sushma, for the invitation. As you said, my work focuses on the gendered effects of racialized policing and punishment, particularly on Black women and girls. I explore the state violence that Black women confront in their homes that leads to death and devastation. We can look at cases like Breonna Taylor, Atatiana Jefferson in Texas, and going back to Eleanor Bumpurs and many others. And it's not just police violence, it's state violence with respect to surveillance and punishment of Black women and others. But it's specifically my focus is on Black women who are subsidy dependent, who are subject to policing, regulation, invasions of their privacy, because they dare to request support, because they dare to exercise their right to get support from the state to raise their families. the policing of Black women when they go into hospitals, looking for support to have healthy children, but instead are confronted by police if there are allegations of drug use and so forth, instead of getting public health support. So my definition of economic justice is distinctly intersectional. That is, it's attentive to the ways that systems of power converge to render individuals and communities more or less vulnerable to various forms of state violence, marginalization, and subordination based on their race, gender, sexual orientation, class, disability, and so on. So my thoughts on economic justice are also informed by the work of radical Black, Latinx, Asian, and intersectional feminists like Loretta Ross and the sister song Women of Color Justice Collective, who articulate reproductive justice, which is a frame that I use frequently in my work as I analyze these systems of punishment and policing that affect Black women, Latinx women, and other Indigenous women and women of color as they try to exercise their capacities of reproductive choice and safety and dignity in their homes and in their communities. And according to Sister Song, they define reproductive justice this way. It's the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children or not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. Asian Communities for Reproductive Justice, which was recently renamed Forward Together, defines reproductive justice as follows. It's the complete physical, mental, spiritual, political, economic, and social well-being of women and girls, which will be achieved when women and girls have the economic, social, and political power and resources to make healthy decisions about our bodies, sexuality, reproduction for ourselves, our families, and our communities in all areas. So what does this mean? How is reproductive justice, intersectionality connected to economic justice? So for me, it means that in order for women and girls to be free, particularly Black, Indigenous, and other women of color to be free, we must have an economy with an equitable distribution of resources that ensures that every person can live in safety and dignity. It means sustainable employment with a livable wage, quality and affordable housing, a safe environment, free and rigorous public education, pre-K through university, universal health care, fully state-supported transportation. It would mean if we have a notion of economic justice that's informed by the insights of Black women and women of color feminists, it would mean the abolition of systems of domination that suppress women and girls, such as racism. As scholars such as Cedric Robinson have argued, racism is a central facet of capitalism, which is, in my estimation, the enemy of economic justice. The two are mutually constitutive. So in order to achieve economic justice, we must radically transform capitalism, and in so doing, topple the racist logics of white supremacy that undergird it. To achieve reproductive and economic justice for women and girls, it would mean that we have to dismantle cis heteropatriarchy, ableism, poverty, classism, and many more. It would mean that we live in a society where policing, jails, and prisons are no longer necessary to ensure security, safety, and accountability. This is why I understand calls to defund the police, a movement that was also developed and led by Black women, as a call for economic justice and a radical redistribution of resources in society to meet the needs of the most marginalized. My definition of economic justice recognizes that Black women have long led movements and conversations about economic policy, pursuing goals that promote economic justice through formations such as the Welfare Rights Organization. And for those who don't know, the Welfare Rights Organization was founded in the 1960s as part of the uprisings of calls for civil rights, racial justice, and movements around anti-racism. They had a decidedly economic set of objectives with respect to how they were pursuing their goals. At its height, it had a membership of about 250,000 people. 90% of its membership was Black or Latinx women. And they were engaged in economic policy that promoted economic justice. They called for a universal basic income, guaranteed safe and affordable housing, the abolition of distinctions among the poor, and in fact, the abolition of poverty itself. They call for robust welfare support and legal protections for people who were subsidy reliant. And they called for, and what they wanted to produce was what one Catholic bishop called an economy in service of human flourishing. And so that's my definition of economic justice, one that's deeply rooted in Black feminist praxis and theorizing by and movements led by women of color, both here in the United States and around the world. Thank you.
Wow. Okay, you've given us a lot to chew on and a lot to think about, and thank you for connecting the dots. I'm wondering, Priscilla, if I could ask you to share, one of the things I really got in a very tangible way in our critical race theory class was understanding this sort of cycle, right, of policing and over-policing that occurs, that it's not just through the police, it's really something that occurs in education and child welfare and like every sort of interface that Black women have in particular with any kind of state agency. So can you just unpack that a little bit for us and then like make that connection between racial justice and economic justice?
Yeah, so I think part of our discussion was about how when we're talking about defunding the police, we're not just talking about beat cops. We're not just talking about, the warders at jails. We're talking about systems of policing. And when we're talking about systems of policing, it's important that we center gender. It's important that we center class as much as we talk about race and racial marginalization. Why? Because it helps us to understand the web of policing, as you called it. So for the Black women that I study, the Black women who I work in solidarity with, the institutions that I study that subordinate and marginalize, surveil and punish Black women, they aren't exclusively traditional police agencies, right? There are various stereotypes that attach to Black women as welfare queens, fraudulent, hyper-masculine, fecund, right, irresponsible in terms of childbearing and child rearing, and essentially that Black women as heads of households are what Moynihan called a tangle of pathology, that are the root of instability and problems not only in the Black community, but in society. And as a result, when institutions interact with them, they engage in a punitive posture that places Black women in a very precarious state. So when we talk about education, we could look at some of the statistics that we lifted up in the Black Girls Matter report, which is that Black girls are the most, are disproportionately suspended and expelled from school at rates higher than their Black counterparts, when their Black male counterparts when compared to white boys. So in the jurisdictions that we studied, Black girls were suspended at 7 times the rate of their white counterparts and expelled at 52 times the rate of their white counterparts. And that disparity is greater than the disparity, again, of Black boys as compared to white girls. Black boys as compared to white boys. And when we look not only at education, we can look at education, but we can also look at systems of what are supposed to be social support institutions, welfare institutions. There are a number of cases from the Supreme Court to circuit courts across the country, which have held that welfare institutions are authorized, despite any prohibitions or warrant requirements of the Fourth Amendment, to search women's homes, to look for evidence of fraud or criminality, which could subject women to criminal prosecutions or the loss of necessary social support, if they refuse to comply. You have these same systems of surveillance in the context of others, what are supposedly other supportive services like child protective services, where Black women are disproportionately, Black women and children are disproportionately represented. And of course, we have prisons and policing, where Black women represent a roughly 30% of the overall population of women who are incarcerated, about 200,000, and another 800,000 women who are subject to state supervision as a result of probation and parole. And so often these are the same women, right, who are subject to policing, probation, parole, who as a result of their incarceration may have children in DCFS, who have another layer of surveillance. These are the same women who are economically marginalized, when they reach out for support from the state through social services or the welfare agencies, again, are confronted with this punitive posture that locks them into a perpetual state of subordination and marginalization that is being produced and then reproduced by these institutions, which is why it's so important for us to center Black women and women of color in our analysis of policing and punishment in the United States.
Thank you. So Margaret, when you were talking earlier about the work of SPLC, you talked a bit about the work around fines and fees. And so can you unpack that a little bit for us, particularly its impact on the cycle of poverty? Because that I think connects quite closely with Priscilla's comments.
Absolutely. So the Southern Poverty Law Center has offices and staff in 5 southeastern states. We are in Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. And we also have an office in Washington, D.C. In those 5 southern states, what we have seen consistently across all of the states is the growing use of a fines and fees system to deprive people of their rights and to actually exacerbate the cycle of poverty. So for example, we see privatized systems where the government has outsourced services intended for people who are returning to community, and then they charge fees of people to receive those services. Similarly, we frequently see driver's license suspension. So let's say, for example, you've been convicted and then you have to pay for your probationary services through a private company. You can't pay those fees, and then they might suspend your driver's license in order to punish you for not paying your fees, which then makes it harder for you to get to a job to be able to earn the money to pay your fees going forward. And so this cycle just keeps continuing and continuing. We're seeing more and more people being put into jail for being poor, for not having the money to pay for fees or to pay for things that they need to survive. And this has a ripple effect across the whole judicial system. As we know, the South has been one of the places that has denied people who have felony convictions from ever regaining the right to vote, which deprives them of having a voice in our political processes and in voting in people who might change the system and make it more equitable and less of a money-making scheme. A number of the districts in our 5 states actually rely on fees and fines to pay for the court system. So we're not talking about small amounts of money. This is an extraordinary amount of money that's actually covering the budget for government services in the South, rather than the government making that investment in its communities and ensuring that people have access to what they need.
So both of you have kind of shared this sort of, very complex web of institutions, laws, and policies that really hold people back, right? And there's multiple layers of disadvantage and discrimination. And I'm wondering, from your perspectives in academia and in activism, what do you see as some solutions or recommendations? What are ways in which we can tackle these very complicated issues?
Thank you for the question. It's a big question, right?
Well, we've got 30 minutes. So.
One of the movements that is the most pressing in our country right now, that I mentioned in my initial response to the question about, how I define economic justice, is the defund movement, right? The movement to defund police and policing and to reinvest in marginalized communities. And I think that is not just a hashtag, it's a significant and important policy intervention that can address many of the issues that you're raising with regard to how policing, law enforcement, punishment facilitates economic marginalization and relies upon, indeed, economic marginalization, racial discrimination, gender disparities in order to operate. So I think that is an important intervention, an important movement for us to rally behind, which is part and parcel to a broader call for economic redistribution of wealth in this country. Another issue, I think the issues that we're both, Margaret and I are raising, is the way in which we approach social problems. So to quote another colleague that participated in the CRT boot camp that you mentioned, George Lipsitz, one of the things that we do is, instead of seeing people with problems, we view the people themselves as problems, and the criminal justice system, criminalization, incarceration, perpetual supervision as the solution. And because we have so heavily invested in policing and punishment, we have essentially starved every other aspect of our society and government institutions. And so when all you have is a hammer, everything is a nail. And so part of what we have to do is dismantle this system of surveillance, criminalization, and policing if we ever want to have hope of disrupting systems of economic inequality. Because again, they're mutually constitutive. They rely on one another in the ways that Margaret described. And one sort of, to put a point on some of the sort of predatory policing that Margaret was talking about in a story that I worked on for the Atlantic magazine about mass supervision and its effect on women. One of the entities that was supposed to be responsible for assisting women coming home from prison from reentry is an organization called GEO Group. And if you're not familiar with GEO Group is one of the largest private prison operators in the country. And sort of probably just kind of sensing the direction of the wind, they shifted some resources away from prisons, it's the physical edifice of an operation of prisons, into so-called reentry and e-carceration, like ankle monitors, halfway houses, reentry centers. And again, it's a perverse relationship, because these same institutions have an interest in people recidivating and returning to prison. So they collect money on both ends of the spectrum, both on entry and upon release and reentry. So there's a way that we really have to disrupt the economic interests in systems of punishment, systems of racial exclusions, systems of gender subordination. So we really have to be clear about the symbiotic relationships between punishment and economic inequality.
So if I could just flag that I just read your article, actually, and it was excellent, in the Atlantic, and maybe we can post a link on that in the YouTube. I just wrote a piece about a week ago, which is in Foreign Policy magazine, which really looks at trends in technology and policing, which people might think is more benign than, having to deal with rogue cops or racist judges, but really global trends and trends in the US should give us pause. So we'll share that as well. Margaret, what about your thoughts? What are some recommendations or approaches that you think might be promising for us to think about?
Well, there's nothing easy or simple or short about any of these recommendations. First of all, we have to really challenge the narrative. As you were talking, Priscilla, I was thinking about how many narratives I've heard over the years about why poor people deserve whatever struggles, challenges, and scrutiny and supervision that they're receiving. I think poor people in this country have always had narratives about how they're untrustworthy, about how they're lazy, about how they're not willing to do the work, about how they're scamming the system. And it's extraordinary when you look at where the capitalist system has directed the benefits of the system. It has never been to poor people ever, but we've struggled to challenge that narrative. And I think that's a place where perhaps at this moment we have an opportunity that we haven't had before to really start challenging these narratives across the board and to think about how to do that strategically. There's a great initiative by a group called the Race and Class Action Narrative that is working to challenge narratives that try to divide communities and constituencies rather than helping us to build together. And so I think really being much more deliberate and challenging ourselves when we hear some of those old tropes being reused, to challenge those narratives and to bring a new narrative that really contextualizes why this work is so important right now. The second thing, of course, is that we have to do more community organizing. Now, this is not a place where the Southern Poverty Law Center has been in the past. It is a place that we're committed to growing as we go forward. And it is because you cannot do this work separate from the communities that you're trying to work with. Advocacy, research, litigation has to be done in collaboration with the people who have the most at stake. And that means allowing stakeholders to have input and contribution and leadership in determining the agenda moving forward. When I look at some of the extraordinary groups across the country who are doing this kind of organizing, I think of groups like BOLD. I think of groups like SONG, Southerners on New Ground. In the Northeast, it's Partners for Dignity and Rights. We have groups that are really committed to doing partnership on the ground with communities to define the agenda and to lay out the course of work, so that those organizations like mine who want to be supportive of this aren't deciding for ourselves what the answer is, but doing it in collaboration and in support of the communities themselves. And then there's the advocacy piece, which can only be effective if we've started tackling the first two. Because if we're making demands about policy changes and legislative changes, and we don't have the constituencies engaged with us to join those calls for change and to help shift the narrative, then the advocacy can never be as effective as we want. And what's really interesting at this moment is while a lot of this advocacy, our tendency is to go to the federal level to try to fix it across the country for everyone, in reality, a lot of these issues have to start at the local level. We're talking about local social services. We're talking about local police. We're talking about local systems and institutions. And if we're not able to see progress at the local level, it's going to be very, very hard to make the shift at the federal level. So we've really got to be thinking about starting in our own backyards and doing this hard work where we are.
You know, that's super interesting. And I must say, we did not coordinate on any of these questions or responses in advance, but our opening webinar, which was last week, also tied to some readings for those of the people who are watching who are part of this economic justice class. And one of the readings we have is by Piketty, and the introductory chapter that we have talks about the power of narrative. And when I read this for the first time, I was really struck by this because I was thinking about sort of data on, you know, income and wealth inequality. And in addition to that, he says, out of the clash of contradictory discourses, a clash that is at once economic, social, and political, comes a dominant narrative or narratives which bolster the existing inequality regime. And he says that in today's societies, these justificatory narratives comprise themes of property, entrepreneurship, and meritocracy. And I was particularly struck by that because we often talk about merit, right? Like in the university setting, that happens a lot where you say, this is a merit-based approach or it's evidence-based. And really, these are based on really practices and policies and laws that really are deeply discriminatory. And in addition to the issue of meritocracy, he also talks about the ideology of borders, which I also thought was very interesting. He says that every inequality regime and ideology rests on both a theory of borders and a theory of property. So very interesting as we really think about sort of this whole debate in the United States, but also around the world as to who belongs and who is worthy of belonging and so on. So I'm going to switch gears and call on a couple of questions that were posted in the YouTube chat. And one question from Alberto is, what should we do and how should we organize when faced with pushback from moneyed, powerful interest, especially when looking at defund movements at all levels? So maybe I'll start with you, Margaret.
Thanks for the question, Alberto. So you're right, it's daunting. And the moneyed interests are both in terms of the political influence behind the policymakers, as well as, frankly, the interest of corporations themselves. Priscilla mentioned, for example, the role of the GEO Group and some of the other privatized detention corporations. Their influence on driving more and more people into detention and incarceration is very, very clear when you look at the policies that have been adopted. But how do we organize is the question, and that's the important one. And what I would say is there are a couple of different ways that we have to organize. There is a reason that so many people are trying to get to take away our vote. There is a reason why voter suppression is one of the biggest games in town right now. The reason is because people recognize the power of a vote. We have the ability to throw out the people in power who are making these bad decisions, who are signing these bad contracts, who are putting into place these bad policies. But it does require us to get active, to register folks, and to get everybody to turn out. And that is one of the most urgent priorities at the moment, certainly for the Southern Poverty Law Center, but frankly, across the progressive movement. We're all fighting very hard to make sure that every vote is received and every vote is counted. So on the political side, we have that opportunity. We can get people registered, we can turn them out to vote, and we can change the people who make the policy. And it does make a difference. Doesn't mean that the moneyed interests won't still be there. But if you get elected into office, not because corporations gave you political campaign contributions, but because you organized and your community turned out, you have a very different game that you can play. On the corporate side, we have to think about other strategies. And there are some great groups doing this. The Grassroots Project in Texas has organized a lot of corporate campaigns against some of these private corporations that are doing immigrant detention work. We have to think about how we utilize shareholder resolutions in companies. We have to think about how we use the moment of all of these companies wanting to show that they are anti-racist and challenging their practices and their policies and their behaviors in ways that they haven't been challenged before. I think this is a really interesting moment, and there's an opportunity to really shift the dynamic so that corporations, if they want to keep customers, have to rethink the ways that they're doing business. So it's a lot of work, but there's really good stuff out there happening that people can join.
So there's a question, maybe I'll pose this to you, Priscilla, which is on if you can explain how bail bonds work and what's their impact, and that's from April.
Sure. So in this country, we have a right to bail as a constitutional matter under our federal constitution. The court shall not levy unreasonable bail, and the idea is to prevent abuses by the state using pretrial detention in a manner that is punitive rather than in a manner to ensure that the person who's subject to arrest or who's facing a criminal charge returns to court or doesn't injure anyone or commit another crime while out in the community. That's supposed to be the purpose of bail. But all too often, bail simply functions to keep people in jail because they are too poor to pay bail. At any given time in this country, there are hundreds of thousands of people in jails because they can't afford bails that have been levied against them. It can be that they're required to put down a deposit of roughly 10% of whatever the bail is with the court, and that's the way it works in California, but all too often people cannot afford that. And so they linger in jails while their cases are being adjudicated, and that can at times take years. And so folks will often plead guilty in order to get out of jail and to return to their lives, their families, their jobs. So this is where bail bondsmen come in. What people, in order to get a loved one out of jail or to get themselves out of jail, people will pay a bail bonds person a non-refundable deposit. And that bail bonds person goes to the court and essentially vouches for the individual who's being detained, and essentially reassures the court that that person will return to court. So the bail bonds industry is $1 billion industry, and initiatives at the local level. So speaking to the point that Margaret just made, to abolish money bail is being vociferously contested by the bail bonds industry. So you see this in New Jersey, in New York, and in California, where there have been real strides to eliminate money bail and to create a presumption of release, which would enable people to more effectively challenge the state, to contest their cases, to continue their lives, to be with their families, to maintain custody of their children. And so essentially it's a massive system of wealth extraction. So if we're talking about economic justice, that's precisely what the bail bonds industry does. There was a study by an organization called the $1 Million Hoods Project, which is based out of UCLA. And they found that over a 10-year period, there were, I think they found something like $300 million was paid into bail bonds people levied against them, and then more millions of dollars were paid to bail bonds people in LA County. And the places where those monies were coming from were the most economically disadvantaged, the most racially marginalized zip codes in Los Angeles County. So you can see that there is a wealth transfer from those who are most unable to pay to these bail bonds people, essentially to launder freedom for individuals who are poor and entrapped in the system of mass supervision, surveillance, and incarceration.
Terrific. We have another question from the audience. Jay asked if you could pick one element of the system of race-based economic injustice to change first, which would it be? Is one thread in this web especially critical or most important strategically?
Well, I view these systems as interlocking. I don't know that we can say any one is the most important, which is why I think we need to have an all of the above strategy. We can't simply focus on policing because of how important housing segregation is to how policing operates in this country. We can't simply focus on employment because of the effect that racialized policing has on people's ability to work. We can't simply focus on white supremacy because of the other ways in which gender, sexuality, sexual orientation are also subject to policing, social regulation, and marginalization as part of systems of racial exclusion. So I think it's an all of the above strategy, and I think it's about empowering folks to realize their power. So to get back to the point about corporations and moneyed interest, part of what moneyed interest try to do is to suggest that the status quo is inevitable. And so what we need to do is to resist that idea, to mobilize people to disrupt the status quo, to pierce that air of inevitability. And that means that we all have to work from where we are, whether we are graduate students, professors, lawyers, organizers, doctors, artists, right? We all have a role to play in transforming the institutions in which we interact, to push for racial justice, to push for economic justice and broader social justice interests. So again, I think it's intersectional because these systems of power are interlocked, and it's multifaceted. So we all have to be engaged. It's sort of an all hands on deck.
Sushma, I could just jump in. I want to absolutely affirm and appreciate what Priscilla just said. I couldn't agree more. And I also want to lift up something that I did not until the last 6 months appreciate how significant it was, and that's food insecurity. And that is something that particularly in our states in the South is stunningly high. And we're seeing dramatic increases across the South in terms of people needing food to survive. And it doesn't take away from anything that Priscilla said. You can't address food insecurity in the absence of any of this other work. But I have to say, to be in the wealthiest country in the world and to have this much food insecurity, they're estimating as many as 1 in 4 children in the country are going to bed hungry every night. That's stunning to me. And if we can't figure out something that basic, then it does raise questions about how effective we can be at all of this. So while I wouldn't say it's more important, I would say there's an urgency there that I've been feeling that I hadn't been as aware of previously. And I don't know why I hadn't, but that's a place where I'm trying to talk about it more so that we can include it in the list of things that Priscilla talked about.
And I also want to lift up something that Margaret said earlier, which is narrative change. At base, many of the institutions and policies, social problems that Margaret and I are discussing rely on a basic ideology, which is that some people's lives simply don't matter, that they are not entitled to safety and dignity, that some workers don't matter. Although they are performing essential work, they are non-essential. And so, going back to the saying, that rhetoric precedes policy, we do have to engage in that narrative change. That means mobilizing, that means utilizing tools of social media, talking and organizing amongst ourselves, really challenging these ideological the ideological foundations of these institutions. So narrative change is tremendously important. And so panels like this, discussions like this, really help us to then come up with a collective vision of what the future can look like. So I think that that's hugely important. Our ability to imagine a new world, our ability to imbue every human being and every living being on this planet with dignity. It will go a long way to transforming many of the systems that we're critiquing and describing on this panel today.
So another question from our audience, Khadija wants to know about, the current environment with coronavirus. What we've seen is, of course, greater health impact, greater economic impact on people who have already been discriminated against and affected by existing laws and policies. So what are your recommendations for, sort of emerging from this current environment, whether it's legislation for COVID relief, things that could lay the groundwork for protecting economic equity?
Margaret, you can start us off.
Thanks, Priscilla. So I don't think that COVID is a phase. I think we have pre-COVID and post-COVID. And I think that's where we are now. Not because we're post it, but because it will now permanently change the way that we're thinking about our world, our society, and how we interact. And it's why I think there is a moment for narrative change, as Priscilla just so beautifully articulated. It is, COVID didn't reveal anything that wasn't known. It has been known, it has been talked about, it has been part of community organizing for generations. And yet, for many people, it was eye-opening to see the statistics laid bare by this disease. I don't know, once you've seen that the falseness of the narrative, if you can go back to pretending that it's not there. And certainly it's our responsibility to make sure that the narrative doesn't go back. So I think that moving forward, we have to rethink this world as a place where this type of pandemic can and will happen again, and that we have to be prepared for all of the ramifications of this, and do, as Priscilla noted, do the world differently. Think about what makes essential workers. Essential workers are the people who are providing food for us to eat at this time. They are the people who are staffing hospitals and taking care of us at this time. It's a different narrative. And so there's a laundry list of policies and laws that we could try to adopt and push forward, and they're all really important. But I think the most important thing is to recognize that the truth has come out because of the pandemic. And what's important is that we build these intersectional movements and we build these cross-racial alliances to keep that narrative strong and help us make the decisions as we move forward. We can't go back to pretending that what we had before was okay, or being nostalgic for what we had before, because it wasn't okay for so many of us.
So, I think I would go back to the mobilizing that was being done by the welfare rights organization and lift up some of their policy prescriptions. Had we listened to them in the 1960s, I think we'd be in a very different place. So that means a universal basic income, particularly to support folks who have been displaced or deemed disposable during this pandemic. It means universal health care, paid family leave, child care and support. It means debt relief for folks, particularly with crippling student loans. It means a moratorium on evictions and foreclosures to make sure that people can be housed, and an expansion of housing support for people who are currently unhoused. It means a significant reduction in our jail and prison populations where COVID is running rampant. Here in LA County, I sit as a commissioner on the LA County Civilian Sheriff's Oversight Commission. And our sheriff's department is one of the largest law enforcement agencies in the country, and arguably the world. We operate the largest jail system on any given day. Pre-COVID, there were roughly 17,000 people in our jails. And more than 50% of them were there pre-trial, largely because they can't afford bail. And during this pandemic, during this crisis, at some points, more than half of the people who are in our facilities, about 12,000, were under some form of quarantine or isolation. And more than 5,000 people have tested positive for COVID in our jails. 8 people have died. And to contrast this against the response of a country that I just came from, where I was doing a Fulbright and also connecting with my family. My dad's Ugandan. The whole country of Uganda has fewer than 3,000 confirmed cases. But in our jails alone, in one county in the state of California, we have over 5,000 cases. So I think those are steps that we can take to support people and to have an ethic of community and commonality and mutuality during this time, which is so sorely lacking. I think we've fallen back on that narrative of disposability, that some people lives simply do not matter. Black folks, Indigenous folks, Latinx folks, the very people who are on the front lines as essential workers, who are not treated like essential workers, the very people who are disproportionately in jails and prisons, and the very same people who are already on the economic and racial margins of our society. So we need to have targeted interventions designed to meet their needs at this moment. And I think in that way, we can really lift up folks who are subject to the most devastation as a result of the fallout from COVID-19 and the wholesale mismanagement of this pandemic by the federal government, certainly, but state governments and local governments across the country.
So I'm going to pivot slightly and come back to something that Margaret had mentioned at the start of our conversation, and that also connects back to the work and mission of the Carr Center as one that's focused both globally and domestically, which was her reference to a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And I'm wondering if each of you could speak to that, and as to, you know, whether you think that is a good approach to really addressing some of the harms from the past and to prepare us collectively as we look forward.
So, you know, I think that telling the truth is always important, right? This is part of the contestation that we're having in this country right now about the truth of this country. Why you have some, particularly in conservative circles, attacking the legitimacy of something I think is as benign as the 1619 Project. And contesting the idea that racism and racial subordination, racial exclusion is at the core of this country and our founding documents, and our ability and the fact that the country is as well off as it is comes as a result of both stolen land and labor. They're contesting that basic idea, that basic truth. So unless we can agree on that, then many of the myths about poor people, about people of color, the individualization of systemic problems will continue to persist. So I think at a threshold level, it's important, but that must be followed then by substantive commitments to radical resource redistribution. It's not enough to simply tell the truth. We then have to step up and take accountability for those hard truths and what they reveal to us. How do we engage in a restorative process or transformative process, even better? So what does it lead us to, I think, is the big question. Of course, we need to tell the truth, but just as significantly, we need to take accountability for the pain, devastation, exclusion, and subordination that those truths reveal, and transform them so that this is a country and a society and a world where we're all recognized as inherently valuable, imbued with dignity, and in need of safety and support wherever we live, wherever we come from, whatever our backgrounds are. I think that's where we need to land, is accountability and transformation.
So I thought I'd share with you, we prepared a memo for a new and potentially new or a renewed administration coming in. I think only one of them will listen to our recommendations, but given that, the Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund prepared a transition memo for a new administration to consider. And amongst them, in fact, the very first recommendation that we've made to a new administration coming in is a call for an executive action to establish a national truth, racial healing, and transformation commission. So I like that word, Priscilla. We are both sharing that. To examine the history of white supremacy and structural racism in the United States. And I think this gets back to our earlier discussion about narrative change. I don't think we can be effective until we have more of the country agreeing on what our shared history is. And I think people have started to see some of that shared history from a different light because of COVID. But I think that's just the scratching of the surface. And I think we have to talk about the history of the United States in its entirety and what it has meant and what the implications are today, of which everything we've talked about on this call is a direct result because of structural racism. So it's a start. It's not certainly the answer. And I think you can see from the examples of other parts of the world and from other parts of the US, by the way, because we have seen truth and reconciliation efforts attempted in different communities here in the US. But if we don't undertake that, if we're not committed to letting the truth guide what our decisions are, then we're not going to get good policy. And so we're very strongly in favor of pushing for this. And we hope that if there is a new administration after the elections this fall, that this will be something that they will take up and champion as we go forward.
Wonderful. Thank you both. I know we're out of time, so I'd like to thank our audience for joining us. And I'd like to thank our speakers for joining us today.